Hi, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Cultural Communication Confidence with me, Victoria Reynoldson. And I'm really excited to be back again for another guest interview. And this week we have Victoria Dale, who is a DE&I specialist and helping HR leaders navigate this, understand their agenda, and how to bring DE&I strategies in place. So, Victoria, a very warm welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me on. Really excited, looking forward to our conversation and sharing my insights with your listeners and viewers.
Fantastic. Amazing. Well, listen, I'm really pleased to have you here. And I know when we spoke probably about a few weeks ago now, I was really excited to talk to you because I think what you're doing in your space is, of course, incredibly valuable and important. And it's something that we all need to know more about. And the first sort of question I want to ask you about is really what's going on right now in the current moment. So, what are the biggest challenges for leaders of businesses that you work with?
So I think some of the biggest challenges is the fact that there's quite a lot of resistance, a lot of backlash to diversity, equity, inclusion, and particularly with being in a recession as well, employers having to make significant cuts. We're focusing on kind of like making cuts than actually, and then kind of the DE&I agenda kind of sort of falls almost like to the bottom of the list. I think that's a key challenge, as well as kind of sort of facing resistance within the organizations. If we look back to 4 years ago with the tragic murder of George Floyd, we saw lots of employers post black squares on Black Tuesday, putting out statements about their response to what happened and what action they're going to take as a result. And I've seen some of those efforts slowly kind of sort of fall under the radar and have kind of less importance. But I'm also seeing leaders as well, grappling with how do we show awareness and respond to some of the, tragic situations happening around the world, particularly with Israel-Gaza crisis, the conflict, and Ukraine. So I'm seeing leaders, trying to sort of navigate those challenges and have those conversations and show employees whose families or personally may be affected by those crises, that they care, and providing that level of support. But yeah, it's quite sort of tricky, challenging times at the moment, I think, for leaders.
And how do you specifically help leaders with this? Because as you say, there are lots of big things going on in the world right now. Plus, they're getting that pressure on their budgets and how they're spending their training, their learning and development budgets. So, what is it specifically that you do to help with that support area?
So one of the things that I specifically help leaders with is, sort of going into their organizations and carrying out what I call inclusion health check and audit, a kind of deep dive review of their people policies and practices, talking to their employees to really understand their perceptions, how they feel about the culture, how supported they feel by their manager, by a leader, how, leaders' commitments are to diversity, equity, and inclusion, how inclusive their people policies are in terms of, responding to and considering the different needs of the workforce. And that really helps to kind of build a clear picture as to where their organization is on its DEI journey, where the gaps are, what needs to improve, and that, essentially provides them with a roadmap, a framework to help them, sort of move forwards, take steps to become a more diverse and inclusive place to work. I also work with leaders in terms of, facilitating conversations through training and through action planning sessions, getting them to understand, how they can be a more inclusive leader. So thinking about some of the traits, thinking about, where they show up as an inclusive leader already, where they need to improve. And obviously sort of critical to that is getting them to understand actually, as an employer, it's really important to show that they care about the workforce, that they recognise that some of the issues outside of work affect how people feel, how they show up at work. And particularly for, for global workforces, it's really important that they're very much attuned to that. and they don't sort of ignore it. They need to, show that they have put in place measures to support them. And I know of companies, particularly, for example, when the Ukraine crisis kicked off a few years ago, employers who had employees that were affected by the crisis, and families who were affected who were living in Ukraine, the employers provided support to kind of basically support that family to get out of war-torn country.
Wow. So there's a huge amount that you do. So I heard you talk about the audits. I heard you talk about training, obviously helping leaders specifically understand what traits and specific behaviors they may need to demonstrate.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about all of that. And what you said right at the end was really interesting. The idea of, it's not enough to know your employees at work. You need to understand the wider context of what's happening outside work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, cost of living crisis is one one massive issue that's affecting a lot of us. And is an example of where employers, need to take action to support employees, particularly those perhaps who, are, sort of earning less, support them in terms of dealing with the cost of living crisis. So I've worked with employers, leaders who have kind of shown empathy and really listened to the employees about what issues are affecting them, and offered sort of incentives or a pay rise to help support them during these difficult times.
Yeah.
Because it is really important, because it's about attracting, retaining the best talent.
Yes, absolutely. And of course that cost of living crisis is affecting not only here in the UK, but obviously other countries around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose, thinking about the kind of wider context of employees' lives as well, I can imagine that for some of the leaders listening to this podcast, that might be challenging to see or realize, because they're not working physically in the same spaces as their teams. So there might be people who are based in many different countries around the world, and they don't actually get together physically that often. So do you have any particular tips or ideas about, for leaders who are leading very diverse teams in different locations, how can they bring more of that empathy and understand more of the wider context of what's going on in people's lives?
Yeah, sure. So I think, sort of holding listening groups, having, sessions with employees, as a leader, also just, in your one-to-ones, checking in, with that employee, that individual, any kind of issues that are affecting them outside of work that are having an impact at work. Surveys as well. I know town hall briefings are quite, very, very common way of communicating with employees, but it tends to be more a one-way rather than a two-way dialogue. And so it's really important to create a kind of provide kind of different channels, a way in which to engage employees to understand what are the issues that are affecting them, sort of have more of a kind of two-way dialogue, two-way conversation to sort of understand. And that could be through, for example, obviously using your employee engagement surveys to understand what are the kind of real issues that are affecting people, and understand, how supported they feel if they're working remotely, how what more can we do to make you feel included at work, what more can we make you do to feel valued, to feel like your voice is heard. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of different ways in which leaders can engage, not just through town hall briefings. So I find that's, whilst it's really important to share information updates about what's going on in the company, there needs to be a bit more kind of sort of more conversations, two-way conversations with employees.
I love that. And I picked up on a sort of interesting term, the listening groups. So I'm kind of curious, how would that look for a manager or leader who's listening to this, and they're thinking, okay, how do I make this practically work so that I'm building connection with people, but I can only do this virtually. So do you have any particular ideas about how to approach that? So it comes across, I suppose, as authentic rather than as forced, or I have to do this to tick the box.
Yeah, I mean, they could use, for example, team meetings, or organize like a virtual lunch, just really to kind of understand, just really kind of checking in how people are. Because I think, going back 4 years ago when COVID lockdown hit, you know, a lot of us had to shift from working face to face to working remotely. And obviously that sort of continues in more of a hybrid model, but sometimes with so many meetings, we kind of forget to pause and have those conversations. So, you know, I think for leaders, it's about reaching out to their colleagues, reaching out to the team members, and, you know, sort of saying that, you know, we value your opinion. We recognize that, you know, we all may be going through different challenges. We work remotely. We want to understand how is it working for you, what needs to change. I think also with listening groups, it tends to be organized through, for example, HR, through, like, they might have like an employee engagement team, but actually leaders can, you know, sort of do that themselves as well. But yeah, things like virtual lunch and learn sessions, and getting the team together remotely, trying different ways to engage people, more interactive. I think also with remote working and technology like Zoom and Teams, there's lots of different ways you can engage people online. That's a lot more interactive than, say, like 4 years ago it was. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting, because in all these tools exist and everybody knows now how to use the tools. That's not the challenge. I think it's actually finding the time and being intentional about making the time for it.
Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking about some of the examples of clients I've been working with, and I know their days are just packed with meetings, like back to back to back. And what has really been lost, I think, in the virtual space is that time for small talk, the chat, that, conversation, but even creating specific time and time to meet when it's actually, we're going to listen to each other. We're going to have conversation. We're not just going to talk about anything to do with business or meetings. I mean, I don't know if that's something you recognize in your world as well.
Yeah, totally. Sort of employers that I work with, leaders that I speak to, particularly through my health check audits, they find that they have kind of back-to-back meetings. They don't have enough time. And I read something on LinkedIn a while ago about, it's important when you're kind of planning your day. Do we really need to have this meeting? Could it be said and done on a phone call or on an email? And so I think it's about being smarter with our time, rather than packing our diary with back-to-back meetings, when actually we could be more productive, creating space in our diaries that might then allow for more of that kind of conversations about how's it going, how can I make, how you just checking in on your team members.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, particularly because there are so many collaboration tools that exist, whether it's meeting or whether it's asynchronously, where you're on a Google Doc together, or Trello, or whatever the planning tools are. So that's very, very interesting. And I also want to go back to something you said earlier, which is, you talked about, it's about listening to every voice, or listening to every person. And I'm really aware that when I think about people's cultural values and their preferences for how they like to communicate, not everybody is very comfortable speaking up and saying exactly what's on their mind. So how in your world do you sort of encourage people to contribute, to say what's really going on? How do you create that sort of, I suppose, safe space to do that without them feeling like, well, either I don't want to say this to my management team, my leadership team, or, I don't want to say it because I feel like I won't be heard anyway?
I think it's about leaders setting the tone, also being role models as well. But, so in their communication to team members, is being clear about, the purpose, and also, if you don't feel comfortable speaking up in the moment, also about having that kind of open door policy if they want to come to you, but also checking on them. How do they feel? There might be, for example, they might be in a meeting and someone's been interrupted or cut off. That person that's been cut off might not feel safe to speak up. They might be on the receiving end of an inappropriate comment. They might not feel safe to speak up, but it's the role of leaders to kind of just check in on them after, because that person might not feel comfortable as well, that leader speaking up in the moment. But yeah, I think it's just really important to reassure that individual that I'm here. I recognize, I heard what that person said, or I saw that they cut you off. I'm here if you want to kind of talk about it. And also, I think it's also just kind of being able to relate to that person where they might not feel comfortable, but actually, I think as leaders, we need to, show how we can speak up in a way that's constructive and helps to raise awareness about recognizing the impact what that person says from the person on the receiving end.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And I think, yes, it's something I'm very conscious of, is that not everybody feels happy just to unmute or say what they think or have a very direct conversation, particularly when higher, like for some, I'm very aware for some people that kind of power dynamic
Yeah.
culturally may not feel totally comfortable, and therefore being open and honest or even critical of senior management, senior leadership might be very, very challenging. I mean, is that something you've ever seen when you've been working with the clients that you work with?
Yeah, definitely, where people don't feel safe to speak up about, a senior manager or leader, in terms of their behavior. They might go to HR, for example. They might just bottle it up and not say anything. Um, and this is where it's important also to have sort of allies as well. People who don't belong to that particular underrepresented group in the workplace. Um, have the courage to kind of speak up, not necessarily in the moment, but might just say something afterwards. Actually, what you said, I'm just curious what you meant by that. Um, you know, that kind of had an impact on me, for example, or, I didn't think that was appropriate. Just so you're aware, as a company, we're about creating an environment that is inclusive of everyone, where everyone can thrive. Yeah, so I think having allies is really important too. And obviously leaders, play a key role in terms of being allies, showing allyship in the
Mm.
workplace. And that includes, sorry, I don't know if I'm kind of going a little bit off track here, but that includes also, in meetings where, for example, singing someone's praise is not in the room. So leaders play a key role in terms of being able to sing, achievements of someone who's not in the room, who's underrepresented in the workplace.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some really great sort of practical examples. And I mean, we've touched on a couple of times today, what traits leaders should demonstrate. So you've talked certainly about active listening, really important, making space for listening and proper listening. You talked there about being an ally, following up if people are not sort of seeming comfortable in the moment. What other sort of traits or what other key behaviors do you think are important for leaders to really demonstrate to the team that they're committed to this?
Yeah, so there's a model that I often refer to in my training, which you might be aware of, Victoria. It's the 6 traits of an inclusive leader. It's research that Deloitte and Touche carried out a number of years ago. They surveyed thousands of leaders across the world, across different industries, and came up with 6 key traits that, I so firmly believe stand to this day, which is, it's about being curious of people whose background is different to yours. So um, and also being aware of their own biases, their own limitations. They don't have the answers to everything. So I think, they need to kind of be open about their weaknesses, where they might have made a mistake. For example, we know as leaders, we want to show that we're always on it, that we're performing really well, and we don't tend to kind of talk about mistakes, but to create that trust, it's important to be open about our own biases. Seek out different perspectives. One of the other key traits, it's called the 6 Cs, is cultural intelligence, as you probably know, is, being curious about different cultures, educating, a key thing that leaders can do is educate themselves about other cultures, different kind of customs and norms, and learning some of the language as well, to make people, people who may speak a different language, make them feel heard, listened, make them feel valued at work as part of the team. And also it's about courage too, about, speaking up, actually, challenging a decision that's been made, or where perhaps someone said the wrong thing or said something inappropriate, is actually, challenging in the moment or soon after the event has happened. And that's kind of sets an example for others as well. That's part of being, what I call an inclusive leader.
Absolutely. This is brilliant. And thank you so much for sharing those. I think that's really, really helpful, particularly for listeners who are wanting to bring more of this into their everyday. And, I'm conscious that we may also have some HR managers and leaders listening to today's podcast. And of course, they're under pressure. They're under pressure because they have a lot that they need to manage and do and achieve and create and deliver. So I'm kind of curious for those kind of people who are listening and they are working in HR and they're thinking, okay, yes, absolutely buy into this for sure. And there's still the pressure on the budgets and the timings of what we need to achieve this year. What do you say to them?
I say it's really important to, to take stock, to ensure that, you, what I call inclusion proof, your HR policies. And, because I guess it kind of goes back to my inclusion health check audits. What they do is essentially is kind of take stock of, looking at organizations' people policies, how inclusive they are, how much they take account of the diverse needs of the workforce, and also speaking to your employees as well, to find out from them through, carrying out surveys, listening groups too. That's part of kind of engaging with employees to understand, what impact, how much of what is written in policy is actually happening in practice. How supported do you feel? Do you know how to report, for example, a bullying harassment incident? Because all that can come back on us and actually cost employers money. So it's important to, diversity, equity, and inclusion should be part of a company's DNA.
Mm.
Employers kind of set ambitions, visions about, we want to be the most diverse and inclusive employer in our market. But actually, if they don't get, if they don't build DEI into their people policies, if they they don't sort of measure progress, gather data, then how do they know where how far they've gone? How do they know what the issues are? How do they know how fair and inclusive their HR policies are? So it will actually save time and money in the long run. There's a statistic, I think it's about £125 billion in lost productivity it costs employers, dealing with anti-discrimination claims and stuff.
Wow.
So
$125 billion.
yeah, probably best not quote me on that. I think it's pounds actually.
Oh, pounds. Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry. But even so, it's a big number, right?
yeah.
That's really, so this is really interesting. I mean, obviously it matters and it's important.
Yeah.
And there is a real
Yeah.
tangible cost to it if we don't get it right.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
really, really
Yeah.
interesting.
So I think it's 1 million, but I will
Yeah, for sure.
So it's, yes, HR leaders might have a big whole load of on their intro to do, but actually if we don't address issues in the workplace, if we don't communicate and train our managers how to deal effectively and efficiently with like things like bullying, harassment, inappropriate behavior, those microaggressions, the day-to-day behaviors in the workplace, it can build up over time and then lead to someone either leaving the organization, taking out a grievance, a complaint, and that can have a real impact on people's well-being, as well as, an impact on resources and money. So it makes sense that it's very much part and parcel of how we do business.
Absolutely. And I'm sort of really curious, like, how did you get into this work? Why is it important to you personally?
It's important to me, really, as a woman and as a parent of a young child, having experienced barriers myself in the workplace, and also growing up when I was at school, I was bullied, so I had that feeling of being different, of feeling excluded, and it's always what's driven me. And having worked previously, before I became self-employed, I worked in an organisation where they didn't value their people. It wasn't people-centric at all. I could see the impact, not just on me, but on others as well. And so that's what really drives me every day, because I know, when we have the wrong behaviors in the workplace, when we have well, we don't have policies that support people to thrive, to feel that their voice is heard, it can have a real knock-on impact on the business. So that's what really drives me to what I do every day, in helping businesses become more diverse and inclusive places to work.
Amazing. Well, that's fantastic. And it sounds like you have a lot of rich resources to help people. So the name of this podcast is Cultural Communication Confidence. And I'm sort of quite curious about, what does that mean to you in your world?
Yeah, so for me, I'm about helping employers, build more inclusive and diverse places to work so that everyone can thrive. And that's about recognizing that to build a more inclusive place to work, it's about creating an environment where people from different backgrounds, working styles and perspectives feel valued, they feel heard, they feel listened, and they feel that they can bring their best selves to work. And so cross-cultural communication is absolutely critical in making this happen, because when we're talking about people from different backgrounds, we're talking about diversity. We don't just mean things like gender or disability. We also mean actually what I call what's beneath the surface, what's hidden. You might have heard of the diversity iceberg. It's a really good illustration. I encourage people to look it up on LinkedIn or social media. But what it really describes is how complex diversity is. So, in terms of cross-cultural communication, diversity, it's about recognizing people might have, come from different cultures, working people from different cultures, different languages, different beliefs, and to create an environment where people feel, actually, I feel recognized, I feel appreciated, I feel valued for who I am. People, are taking into account my particular communication preferences, my cultural needs. That is really important in terms of, when it comes to building a more inclusive culture.
Amazing. That's really, really great. Thank you so much for sharing, Victoria. And I am, I'm really kind of keen that if there are some listeners today who are listening to you and thinking, right, either for me, myself as a leader, or for the team, we really need to do some more work here. And, I'm kind of interested if you could share sort of how people could find out more about you, or could kind of go deeper with you on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. It's been a really interesting discussion. So yeah, they can follow me on LinkedIn. Yeah, on Victoria Dale, DEI is my tag on my
Yeah,
LinkedIn profile.
we'll put your details in the show
Yeah,
notes.
sure.
Don't worry about that.
And my business is called Inclusion 365. I founded it in 2019, and it's based on the firm belief that when it comes to building a more inclusive, diverse place to work, it's not the one-off initiatives. It's not once a week, once a year. It's those everyday actions that we take every day. So, building inclusion into everyday conversations, actions, decisions, and behaviours. So yeah, that's yeah.
Excellent. That's great. Well, we'll put all your links in the show notes. And of
Thank
course,
you.
if people want to find out, you mentioned the audits and education training. Yes, obviously, please do go talk to Victoria about that. But thank you so much for joining me today. It's been really fascinating to deep dive into this topic and find out the latest perspectives on DE&I. So I think I've learned lots. I'm sure the listeners have too. So really appreciate you joining me here today, Victoria. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria, for inviting me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
No problem at all. And look forward to seeing everybody soon on Cultural Communication Confidence.